Sawadee krab. Welcome members to our IoT event. My name is Kulvech Janvatanavit, the CEO of Thai IoT, and we would like to welcome you to Director Briefing. And this topic is going to be very, very relevant to all of us, especially right now. The topic is Reenergizing and Refocusing Board Member in 2021. Before we start, please be informed that the operation during the activities, you are going to be on mute. And if you would like to ask something, please go to chat and send your question to all panelists. And we'll make sure that your answer is being addressed. So this morning we have two guests from McKinsey, and we would like to thank McKinsey once again for your great support to IoT, and many of your knowledge and your topic are so interesting. The first speaker is Mr. Joydeep Sengupta. He is the senior partner of McKinsey and Company Singapore, and he is also the leader of Asia Strategy, Organization and Corporate Governance Practice. And the second one, who is calling in from Amsterdam, Mr. Rob Theunissen. He is a partner of McKinsey, and he is the co-author, right, of this concept of re-energizing and refocusing for the corporate after the COVID. So COVID has caused us fatigue that we realized and we did not realize. We realized that we have to fight the fire, the revenue is shrinking, and the budget that we finish and get the board to approve in December, we had to revise it again. So a lot of things is going on here. So this topic, we would like to ask the two of you to share your view of how can the boardroom help management revitalizing these fatigue and turn crisis into opportunity. So with that, I will start asking Kun Joydeep. Please, Kun Joydeep, what is your, what have you seen so far?
Thank you. And good afternoon to all. It's a real privilege and honor to be sharing some of our thoughts and perspectives with you today. And hopefully my colleague Rob, Amai and I will be able to address some of the questions that you have. What I'm going to talk about today are two things. One is, what does it mean in this context to be an effective board? And what are some of the things that we are hearing both from management teams as well as from board members in terms of how effective boards are? And in that context, also share with you a little bit of how the role of the board has changed in the context of the COVID environment. So we have been, over the last several months, working quite closely with several of the boards to try and understand what has changed. And what I will do is I'll briefly touch upon some of those. And then one of the things which I'd certainly like to share with you is what we see as the impending need for organizations to win the COVID exit. For better or for worse, all of us have gone through a fairly challenging 2020. And 2021, we certainly hope will be the year when we are out of COVID at some point. And really the question is, when we are out of COVID, what will change and what are some of the things which will be of the highest priorities for companies and therefore the boards? And I'll touch upon 5 or 6 themes which we think are going to be particularly important. And then I'll hand over to Rob, who will really share his perspectives on what it takes to reorganize, re-energize, and refocus organizations, especially as many organizations have gone through probably a very, very challenging time, not just from a point of view of the change, but also many new phenomena like mental health, fatigue, etc., which have become quite endemic in many organizations. So with that, I'm going to also go through this material quite quickly so that I can leave enough time later for question and answers, if that is okay with you. Firstly, I think just a quick snapshot. It's very clear that increasingly CEOs and really the top teams spend a lot of time on board-related matters. So if you talk to an average CEO, he would or she would say that, look, I spend 25 to 30% of my time managing boards, and managing board is probably the most important stakeholder for me. And yet, when we ask them, how effective are those meetings and how relevant have they been for you, less than 15% feel that the board, the contribution are truly effective and shaping. And on the other hand, when we talk to really the board of directors themselves, 90% of them feel that these interactions and engagement has been quite effective. So the first thing is there is a big gulf in perception between what management represented by CEOs and what directors feel. Now, if you move to the next page, I think one of the things why that happens is that there is a clear understanding or an expectation from CEOs that their directors and their board will have a good understanding of various aspects that are important to the decisions that they make. So for example, talent situation, really understanding what is the talent required to succeed in the fast changing environment, what is the current bench strength, how well are organizations equipped to execute given the talent. And at least, as we talk to various board members, and this is from our survey that we had covered over nearly 1,200 board members, more than half of the board members believe that they don't have a very good understanding of that situation. Similarly, if you look at things like what are the drivers of the business, the risks that companies face, more than a quarter actually believe that they don't have a very good understanding. So this is a little bit the context, as you may, for where we are looking at some of the challenges. Now, as we move forward, there are a few things which are real expectations that we think are quite important for the board. And one of the things I have personally been on several governance committees set up by regulators over the years in many markets to look at the role of boards and what boards should do. And in general, if we had to generalize, there are 5 or 6 themes which are quite important. One is obviously strategy. And I think this is something that increasingly boards do very well. But it is not about approving a strategy once a year. It is about being an ongoing partner in challenging strategy, looking at the portfolio, thinking of value added, thinking about capital allocation and reallocation, looking at some of the trends, discontinuous trends, whether it's in digital and data, and really helping, if you may, in a much more dynamic way, supporting, encouraging, and enabling management to execute their strategy. So that's one very important shift which we are seeing as expectations from boards. The second is, I think, again, and all of you certainly are very familiar with the role of boards in approving organic investments or in reviewing M&A targets, but really thinking about how do we make sure that these investments are consistent with the changing strategy and delivering on multi-year value creation commitments. And what we mean by that is typically we have seen boards approve large investments, but then as the dynamics of the market changes, the follow through on are those investments providing the right returns? Do we need to reallocate both capital and talent on a much more dynamic basis? I think that's something which we have now seen as expectations. Many organizations have moved from an annual cycle now to a much more quarterly cycle. in terms of both creating of budgets, creating of investments, and the ability to manage that more dynamically is the second element which we are seeing quite important. The third is risk, and goes without saying that I think the role of risk management has really got alleviated in this environment. And there are many new risks. Historically, enterprise-wide risk management was an important role, but today there are many new risks, whether it's around cybersecurity, whether it's around the tail risks like we saw during the COVID environment. And really, I think thinking about whether risk is itself embedded in the culture of the organization, and how do you balance between the values and ethics of an organization versus the pure profit motive. I think that's something which increasingly there's an expectation, not just from management, but also from external stakeholders in terms of what roles the board should do in being guardians, in effect, of the values of the organization. 4, 5, and 6 are very much to do with organization, whether it's HR and culture. It's no longer just about CEO succession or approving compensation, but much more about ensuring a comprehensive talent strategy, much less about just the quarterly earnings, but making sure that the longer term, not just performance, but also health is being monitored. This is something that we have seen consistently now, and there are many task forces which have been set up, including the long-term capital management task force, which is beginning to look at what does it take for boards effectively to change the incentives of management to continue to focus on just quarterly earnings, to making sure that they are building sustainable long-term businesses. So the notion of value for the long term is becoming quite important, and by implication, it's no longer how we're doing and signing off on the quarterly earnings, but the drivers of long-term value and how we are doing against that, that's becoming an important theme. And finally, I would say just the notion of reviewing, reporting on compliance, to really actively looking at renewing policy, changing policy more aggressively, and looking at engaging with external stakeholders, whether it be with activist investors or indeed with regulators in shaping policy. That's the other expectation. So really, in a sense, the big shift that we are seeing is being from a more static guardian of the organization to being a more proactive challenger and a partner in the organization's progress. That's really the big shift that we are beginning to see in terms of expectations. Now, one page forward, this is one of the questions, right? But when we look at these, are boards living up to the expectations? And this is just a very quick snapshot of the survey, the same survey we had conducted in 2017 and 19. And what we really begin to see is that certainly on some dimensions, we are seeing boards doing particularly well, whether it's around rethinking strategy, rethinking performance management, and certainly all of the fiduciary duties of the board in terms of making sure finance, accounting are all in place. Some of the other elements, particularly around risk, around shareholder, stakeholder management, investment, there's much less time spent than what is probably required. And that's, I think, one of the questions which we are picking up. So with that as kind of a little bit of the background, and I would certainly urge you, should you want to know more about these and what the underlying, please do reach out to us, and we will be very happy to share with you much more detail around this. In fact, we would encourage you to even participate in the survey, right, as a way of beginning to get peer feedback on how you are doing versus other boards around the world. What should the focus be for 2021? There are 2 or 3 things which are quite important, which we are seeing the current environment begin to focus on. Firstly, I think what one would call the Stockdale syndrome, right, in some ways, which is the challenge. Boards have to be optimistic in this environment because everyone else is not. Yet, I think being realistic and not being over-optimistic and finding the balance between hope and enthusiasm while finding new opportunities and realistic goals. I think this is a fine line which as we talk to board members, this is something which they're really straddling at any point in time. The new normal, I think all of you have heard about the new normal, and there are many versions of the new normal which are going around. But I would say that this is the time for strategy in some ways, and really rethinking the strategy and really reshaping what it will take to operate in an environment which is inherently a low growth environment, a low interest rate environment. There are pockets and businesses which are collapsing versus some businesses which are doing really well. So how do you really manage that? I think that's a second big topic. I think the third, and I would really underscore this, and I'm sure Rob will talk about this more, there is a gulf between the executives and staff, and we are seeing that widening. So for example, during the COVID crisis, many senior management felt that, look, we are able to communicate better, we are talking to each other more, our Zooms are working really well, we are taking faster decisions, and all of that is very positive. But at the same time, if you go down the line and talk to the front line, many of the junior employees, many are suffering from mental stress, people are feeling isolated, etc. So the gap between the top management and the mass employee base is actually widening, and really taking a look at that gulf and how that might translate itself into the health of the organization is a third theme. And fourth is, I think, the fact that there are many industries and sectors and indeed professions which are struggling and require support. And depending on which industry you are in and or which industries you're straddling, I think the reactions have to be quite different. So that's some of the themes which certainly we are picking up. A few other thoughts. I think one is, given the uncertainty and given even today we are not yet clear, certainly I'm not, as to what the world will look like in 6 months, 12 months, 24 months time. So it's hard to be definitive in terms of strategy. And therefore, I think we would encourage boards to think in terms of scenarios and to plan your strategies in terms of scenarios. And what do you create resilience? What will create resilience under different scenarios? So that's number one. Number two is, I think, really asking the difficult questions. What is going wrong? What can go wrong? Where should we focus? Governments are becoming increasingly more important. And I know in Thailand, you are more used to it than in many other markets. But I think around the world, I think the role of governments, particularly the huge stimulus programs that have been put in, makes governments an even bigger stakeholder in the corporate world than in the past. And so managing government relations and working with that is a new skill for many organizations. And how do you as board members help and support management teams in doing that? Fourth is really this notion of purpose. And I'll talk more about it, it's increasingly becoming quite important that the obligations of a company is no longer just to your shareholders, but to the broader society and to broader stakeholders. Again, I would say with my what I know of Thailand, I think companies in Thailand are far more pivoted on that than many other economies. So you have done, companies in Thailand have always been conscious about broader stakeholder and broader purpose, but I would say that this is becoming even more important so now. And finally, I think the balance between innovation and resilience. And when I talk a little bit about some of the trends that we are seeing, that's the other element which is quite important. So how do you be agile? How do you be creative, and how do you move fast? At the same time, how do you build stability? And while they may seem paradoxical, in some ways you have to think about both together. So these are some of the elements which we think are quite important in terms of where boards should be focusing on and engaging with their management team. I'm going to just take 3 more minutes and talk a little bit about some of the themes that we think are quite important. And to contextualize the theme, maybe I'll start a little bit with one chart, which is quite staggering. I mean, all of us know that, and we have been talking for years about digital and data, but I think if you look at COVID accelerating change, I think what we have seen is dramatic change being accelerated. So this chart just represents one aspect of that dramatic acceleration. So if you look at e-commerce penetration, and this is for the US market, in just 3 months, we have seen e-commerce penetration go up, as much as in the last 10 years. So just let that sink in. In 3 months, it's grown as much as in the last 10 years, and this trend continues. And you can look at across businesses, whether it's in the consumer goods business, in the e-commerce business, whether it's in the banking business, we are seeing this quite dramatic shift. So the need for speed, the need for innovation is going up quite significantly. What that implies, among of course, the fact that organizations need to double down and win the digital and the data game, is also the fact that there is a need to rethink the organization. And the next page kind of lay out, if you may, what are some of the things that we think become quite important. And I'll just talk a little bit in very simple terms what these are. I think there is a very fundamental rethink around the notion of who we are, right? And this notion of purpose, which guides our decisions from our boardroom to the front line, has become really centerfold, right? Organizations around the world are asking the question, why do we exist? And what is our purpose for being here? And I think this is being driven a lot by consumers. It's being driven a lot by external stakeholders who are forcing this question to be asked. And the pandemic has really accelerated, in some ways, the notion of purpose. I think value, very important, and very few organizations really get a sense of where is value being created, why do we exist, but also where do we create value? And understanding the 30 to 40 value creation levers or the value creation areas within the organization are quite critical. And finally, our culture, which is what makes us successful, i.e. what is our secret sauce that drives our performance? And every organization has its own secret sauce. So this notion of really sharply defining who we are as the first pillar is becoming a very important element which we see organizations doing. The second is around how we operate. And this is where the notion of the old world of matrix organizations with multiple reporting layers, lots of layers, lots of bureaucracy in ways decisions get made is being significantly challenged. One of the things I pointed out in the COVID world, people were able to take decisions much faster. And so we are looking at new structures, new way of managing talent, flatter organizations, faster organizations. And the last is how we grow, which is how do you interface no longer with internal organizations, but also the external world. So the notion of ecosystems, the notion of data and learning, rapid consumer learning is becoming a very important part. So this in some ways is something which we are seeing almost all organizations go through a real rethink in the way they are structured, in the way their purpose and how they actually grow. And finally, I think if you synthesize all of that on the next page, I think what we are really seeing is a notion of sustainability becoming quite important. I will come back to this if you move to the next page, please. Is around these 6 messages. One is COVID has created a great acceleration and amplification. Winners, the gap between winners and those who are behind is only widening at the moment. Disruption is happening both to the size and shape, both in terms of demand, but also in terms of the business model. So third, momentum and direction from which you emerge is determinative for a decade. What we mean by that is your current position, because if you are in a strong position, the acceleration that you will get will allow you to win over the next decade. And if you're not, I think it's going to be a big distance. So especially momentum will create opportunities for mergers, acquisitions, which I think we are going to see a lot more. So that should be a pretty important element. And finally, I would say that just organizing for speed, organizing for sustainability and purpose are elements which will shape the CEO agenda. So let me stop at this stage. I'm not going to go through all of these elements, recognizing that I'm already about 5 minutes behind time, and hand over to my colleague, Rob, for the next part of it, which he'll talk a little bit about re-energizing and refocusing the organization.
Rob, before you begin, may I take 1 minute to summarize what Joydeep just said?
Please.
So, firstly, there is a huge gap of expectation between CEO and the board about what the CEO should expect from the boss, and that's kind of very dramatic. And also, the role of the board right now is more intense, more dynamic, more agile in order to address the sustainability through strategy, investment, risk, HR culture, performance, and compliance. Even the word compliance doesn't mean compliance to regulation now. It's compliance to the expectation of the stakeholders. And that's a huge, huge new world. And then we talked about, you said that the board living up to the expectation. I'm not sure if it's the word living up or catching up, because the world dynamic has changed a lot. And I'm sure that many of the board are not only catching up, but they are ahead of the game too. Okay, and you said that in order to go forward, the strategy, asking difficult questions, purpose, innovation. What I kind of my key takeaway here is it starts with soft side. It starts with people. It starts with human-centric, which reminds me of the article I read from you, Rob. So please feel free to add your wisdom on this.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great privilege to be with you today. I will be talking about a topic which I think is super critical around the world. And let me start with giving you a bit of context on the next page. What we see in the world around us, if you move to the next page. No, the previous one, number 15, thank you. Yes, what we see around the world is a staggering amount of symptoms of fatigue, one way or the other related to fatigue. The number that is really striking, and in some publications the number is even higher, but 75% of people in the US and a third in the Asia Pacific report symptoms of burnout. We see that 3 times more than before the crisis, people rate their mental health as very poor. And I think the word mental health you surely will see pop up everywhere around you in the last couple of months, and it's really getting a top line in what the focus of the world is. And then 39% of leaders have had personal experience with being affected by COVID. And in many ways, the current environment has not only exacerbated stress and fatigue, but I think even before the crisis, this was a big topic. Now, the way we frame this very big human crisis, and because that's what it is primary, we frame this from an organizational perspective, not only as a big crisis, but actually also as a huge opportunity. And let me talk to you why we think that. Number one, we think that before the crisis, a lot of organizations were not yet what we call healthy. We see many over-controlled, sometimes fear-based cultures. And what COVID has done, it has accelerated that fear. And what it basically has done, it has turned the light on a phenomenon that we took for granted. You see, if you read the history books, when humanity was created around 70,000 years ago, the first human communities were built around the fabric of human connection. And there are many routines and micro habits in human communities that facilitate this connection. And one of the most primary ones that even existed 70,000 years ago was simple things like gossip, like talking with and about each other. And COVID, due to the isolation, has cut these wires of human fabric in organizations. Now, if you live in a fear-based organization, that feeling connectedness, that provides safety, psychological safety, is very important. It was broken during COVID. And what we saw around the world is people working harder than ever, making 15, 18 hours days on Zoom, etc. And partly that is because there's a crisis. But I think we believe that to a large extent, this was only fed by the need to feel connected. And therefore, what we've seen is workloads going through the roof, which obviously has also fueled the sense of fatigue. And this is an important lesson that we have, that I wanted to start with. Now, if you look at what has happened over time on the next page, you could see this as what we call this curve. And this curve is very similar to the human response to trauma, even death in your family, or it's called the mourning curve in many publications. But what has happened is when the disaster hit us, the initial reaction from an energetic perspective was that energy was going up. People were fighting. And if you remember the first 3 months, everybody was completely blown away with the amount of decisiveness, the speed of decision making, the amount of collaboration, the resilience, agility. We were really blown away. But then when the second wave hit, the curve went down. And the curve went down very deeply. And this is the phase of where depression kicks in. And then over time, you see people starting to reframe reality into something that is acceptable. And when acceptance gets in, the energy goes up again. Now, this pattern is very normal in the psyche of human societies. But what we also learned is you can actually actively manage this curve to some extent. And this is shown on the next page. You see overlaid with the blue line, a red and a green line. And the red line is when leaders during crisis start making promises that feel right, but are not realistic. And we learned this from combat armies. We spoke to an admiral of the US Navy, and we explained to us when your soldiers are in the trenches and you make promises like, don't worry, you'll be home by Christmas, and then Christmas comes and you're still in the trenches. That hits you actually even deeper into depression because there's even less of a light at the end of the tunnel, and it takes longer to get back to the initial energy level, and maybe you never get back. Because the disillusionment on top of disillusionment really does something to your energy. What you can also do is the green light. And this is a different pattern that doesn't go as deep in depression and gets you actually to a higher level. And this is where leaders react to crisis, what we call a bounded optimism. It's helping people reframe the crisis in terms of their day-to-day reality, find purpose in it, and help people to accept the reality as a new state of being. And that is what bounded optimism, it's what Joydeep spoke about. Yes, there needs to be hope, but there also needs to be realism. Don't make promises about uncertainties that are not there. And that level of bounded optimism we felt, and we learned from these armies, is an incredibly powerful means. And I think here's where boards can keep their management sharp of being optimistic, but also realistic. That is the first thing that we can do, is to manage the energy in an organization very proactively. And it's interesting when we ask people around the world, as I'm doing these presentations, where are you on the curve? It's interesting to see that people are still all over the curve, because obviously the waves are hitting different geographies at different times in the world. Let's go to the next page. Now, what we also saw, that there are organizations that are simply dealing much better with COVID than others. For instance, to Joydeep's earlier point on agility, we see that organizations that are already in an agile operating model, that it consists of highly empowered cross-functional process teams in very flat layers. That's where we see connection between these teams is very strong, and people react much more autonomous and purposeful. We see also companies invest heavily in the adaptability skills. These are leadership skills around resilience, around reframing reality, helping people to frame and accept reality as it is, instead of fighting or feeling victim, falling back to victim. We see human-centric organizations. Someone used the term earlier today. Maybe it was you, Mr. Kulvech. But this is the organizations that actually have a value around empathy, around truly believing that humans and culture is the one and only competitive edge. And therefore we very, very carefully care about these people. Now, that does not mean that we create warm baths for people to be happy in. No, no, no. This is a world where accountability plays a big role, but it is always anchored in a sense of compassion and empathy. Purpose. If there's any time to connect to purpose, it's this time. We see a groundswell that was already ongoing for several years, where there was a louder and louder cry from both external stakeholders, but also particularly the young employees around, I want to work in an organization that actually not only is there for financial gain, but has a broader positive role in the world. The why of the organization has become increasingly important to attract top talent. And therefore, to Joydeep's earlier point, this is the moment to actually double down on instilling the sense of purpose. I spoke already about agile and digital technologies as enablers of speed and agility. But I think we also saw in COVID let's say, a glimpse of what the future could hold. If you just think about that early stage of COVID with all that energy, that collaboration, that innovation, that fast learning, that decisiveness, that should be a glimpse of what the future can hold. We just need to institutionalize it in a different way. And that's why we need to rethink how we think about leaders, how we think about operating models. But once we get it right, you see some of the numbers on the right-hand side of the page. This COVID crisis is an unbelievable opportunity to rethink and actually lift our organizations to a much higher level than before. And personally, I feel incredibly inspired by that, because I've been doing this work for 25 years. I started to work on the shop floor factories, and I was just staggered as a young 25-year-old how little of the creativity and talent of the people on the shop floor was used in the 90s. And I put it to you that even today, most of organizations do not yet facilitate full human potential. Let's use this opportunity, yes, use this crisis to come out even stronger. If you go to the next page. So it is about now, and it's about trying new things. And what we see is that the most powerful interventions today are made by companies that basically act on multiple scales. Number one, they act on a short-term scale. And in the short term, it's about being decisive, but also about instilling that sense of empathy and connection in the company. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But at the same time, they also are extremely choiceful and purposeful and bold in their strategic decisions. So this is the moment to rethink operating models, culture, but also strategy. Please go to the next page. Now, there is unfortunately not a single recipe, because we have to recognize that companies live in very different contexts, in very different industries. But what we do see is that there are a few ingredients in a company's recipe that seem to hold in multiple contexts. I spoke already about purpose and values. Incredibly important. This is the time to show your real true self in that sense. The second one is there is no perfect one. We see a lot of experimentation. I mean, if anyone claims to have the new normal solid, then I would like to see it, because every new normal might be very contextual. However, what we learned is that there is one leadership skill that is incredibly important. One. And the one that we saw as incredibly important is, it may sound very basic, but it's extremely powerful. And that's the human skill of listening. Listening. Let me tell you a short story about listening. I was serving a bank in the Netherlands. And this bank, and this was pre-COVID, mind you, the bank had been suffering by not being able to drive the culture or the organizational health to the next level. They were plateauing and the leadership was getting incredibly frustrated. They tried everything. And one day they turned to us and said, oh, we need a new story to energize our people. I said, well, do we really know that's as a fact? And we send them all out to have 3 90-minute listening sessions with peers across the organization, no more than 10, 15 people at each session. And there was only 2 questions: what gives you energy, what drains your energy? And then for 90 minutes, these leaders were asked to basically be silent and listen deeply. And we taught them the 4 levels of listening, including empathic and intuitive listening. And after the end of those 3 sessions, both the participants and the leaders came out with an incredibly aha. They had experienced insights they could never have imagined. But they also experienced these sessions as extremely powerful. There were emotions varying from inspiration to shame and everything in the middle. But during that process, besides the content, what happened is a reconnection between those people, a deep human connection, because you reconnect not on the superficial transactional level, but on the emotional and intuitive, the values level. So the listening exercise in itself not only guides you to the right interventions to energize the organization, it is actually a powerful intervention in itself. It brings back the human in human leadership. And it's again to what I said in the beginning, the fabric of human society is made of human connection. And that is about dialogue, real dialogue, even gossip, as I mentioned earlier. The other thing we see in number 3 here is that we knew this before COVID. When we spoke about organizational health, we said, look, as leaders, you are accountable for performance of the organization and the health of the organization. But COVID has taught us that it's not only about the organizational practices, your health practices, it's actually feeling accountable for the mood of the place, feeling accountable for the energy of my team. And this, again, we learn from combat armies. It's incredible what much we can still learn from armies. The level of sophistication that young officers are being trained in combat armies by being extremely conscious on where to physically show up in a battle context, but not only where to show up, how they emotionally show up is incredible. They know when to bring a sense of direction and command, but they also know when to bring a sense of empathy when a team returns from the battlefield, for instance. It may sound obvious, but the level of sophistication in day-to-day practices is incredibly insightful for many people in non-combat organizations. It is an opportunity to finally wage a war on business. 18-hour days on Zoom, it's unsustainable. And if you think about the young families with kids running around the home, it's incredibly, we have to actually allow them find ways for emotional and physical recovery. We have to talk recovery as a part of our daily practice. It's something we used to be able to take for granted. Well, for sure, we cannot take it for granted now. And lastly, we don't have all the answers, so let's not pretend that we do have the answers. And here is where we can challenge our management. Actually, do you really need a new story, like my banking example? Do you really understand what's cooking deeper in the organization? Do you really understand what's cooking? And invite them to actually go see, go talk, and go listen. If you go to the next page. So this is my final page. And recognizing that each organization will have to learn its own way, we do believe that there are a few anchor points. It starts with purpose. You see, my work is in transformation. And I've learned already a long time ago that burning platforms are nice because they get you out of the gate. But what gets you to the finish line is this burning, purposeful aspiration. It's in purpose. There is infinite energy almost. It's like Winston Churchill used to say, or once said, it's easier for men to lay down their lives than to give up their livelihood. And that's all about being purposeful. So there's almost infinite energy and creativity and resilience if you connect to purpose. And to get there are 3 pillars, as we have learned in the last year. Yes, there is an element of deepening skills. And these are the human skills, leadership skills around resilience, adaptability. And we have actually started with some of our clients doing very intense leadership journeys where we actually deepen these skills, and they are tremendously impactful because, again, in these sessions, new human connection, empathy, and compassion actually pop up. And taking whole organizations through these learning programs can be incredibly impactful. The second here in the middle is focus on care, connection, well-being. Again, going back to the human fabric and how people feed off communities through feeling connected. We have seen many creative solutions out there, going from the good old-fashioned daily check-ins and check-outs at the end of your Zoom meeting. We have seen practices around using 15-minute standard breakouts as part of your meeting with no agenda. Just connect, just talk. It's like you instill a virtual coffee corner or water cooler moment in your meetings. We have seen leaders picking up the phone or the Zoom more just to connect and have a chat. Again, to force back that human connection into your day-to-day work. But it's also about the story. Every culture is defined by the networks of story it lives in. Like Yuval Harari, this famous Israeli professor that wrote the book Sapiens, you may have read it, has written. And it's so true. And I think many organizations have become very, very good in engineering communication. Here's my message, here's the 3 reasons why. It's a very left brain story, and it's fueled with PowerPoint. But humans don't feed off of left brain stories. Yes, the logic needs to be there, absolutely, no doubt about it. But what energizes people is the right brain part of the story. I mean, no movie that ever has touched you is built on the pyramid principle of communication. The stories that have fueled you, that have filled your soul, that make you weep, are stories that are anchored in very human elements like identity. Who are we? To Joydeep's point. It's about betrayal. If we don't do this, which value is being betrayed? What's the ultimate fight? And mind you, it's not only the fight against the enemy, it's mostly a personal fight with yourself. And then the beauty, going back to the purpose, those have to be part of the narrative that truly energize people and reinstill that purpose. You cannot launch a purpose, you can only engage in purpose. And finally, it's the mechanics on the right-hand side. And we believe this will be a huge accelerator of the organization of the future that Joydeep was speaking about, the agile organizations, where leaders don't control anymore, but leaders direct and build highly talented, high-performing teams. And that's a super mindset shift, a very exciting mindset shift, because this will serve multiple purposes. It will create healthier business, healthier society, and it will create healthier human beings. And throughout, I believe listening will be a core element to instill back into our organizations. And that's where you as boards can have a tremendous role, I believe, if I may say so. With that, I think if you go to the next page, we have come to the end of the formal presentation, and let me hand back to our chair.
Wow. That's all I can say. I have goosebumps. Just to summarize, you said that the fatigue from pandemic on mental health is more profound than the damage on numbers such as on balance sheet or GDP. And you said from adrenaline to depression. And you said that in the past, we might manage time, but now we have to manage energy.
Correct.
We have to turn purpose into passion, and from passion into empathy, the old way of connection, which would lead to courage to change and lead to sustainable performance. You said it's almost like the purpose is like a North Star. I saw the star, and when in a stormy sea, you can't hold on to anything else. You have to hold on to something higher, and everyone can see clearly. You said feeling accountability for the energy of the level of energy. You said it's okay not to be okay. It's almost like we have to be true to ourselves and let our belief lead us all. This is a new thing. Joydeep, what do you think? And how could we link this to how the board could restore humanity into the organization that need IT transformation?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I must say that even though I've heard Rob many times, even I had goosebumps. So, having made that, and I do think that the linkages between what the board needs to do and some of the elements that Rob talked about are really at the heart of the rethinking of, how organizations need to come out of COVID and think quite differently, right? And I think, for me, this is not about board members ticking the box on saying that, we've solved for, organization re-energy, or we have solved for organization strategy, but about engaging with the CEO and the top team very much in a dialogue around, in this new world, how do we create a much more purpose-driven, energy-driven organization which is moving at pace, right? The notion of agility becomes really important in this context. We are meeting our customers' needs have changed, our stakeholders' needs have changed. And by the way, our stakeholders, a big part of our stakeholders are our own employees, right? So the way our employees are feeling at this point, the way we need to build energy, and this notion of maximizing energy is a really important notion, right? We are managing energy, we're not managing time. And in a way, that's for me, really, in some ways, a central linkage that board members have to bring through in the discussions with management. So it would reinforce the point I was making earlier about this no longer being a static overview role, but a partnership role, right, for boards with their organizations.
Okay. Everyone is overwhelmed with firefighting at the moment, how to secure the income. New compliance has been introduced, new regulation has been introduced, especially on financial institutions. At the same time, we have to rethink business model. We have to understand the new behavior, the change of behavior of our consumer. And now we talk about purpose. We talk about energy. How do we start? How should the board start? Because the board, this is a different ball game. And in the past 60 years, we were not, our organization were not constructed for this kind of soft side. It's always hard side, it's always KPI, it's always goal, it's always everything is measurable. And now we start talking about something that is so powerful, but it's intangible. So with all this short-term crisis, with all the long-term thing that we have to think, and this soft side, how do we start to change?
So maybe I offer a perspective, and Rob, please do feel free to add in. And I go back, Rob, when he was giving his talked a lot about the learnings from the armed forces and what you learned from the army, so on. And I would go back to the Vietnam War, right, a bit. And one of the learnings from the Vietnam War, when you talk to the generals who were there in terms of what were the lessons learned, I think one of the big lessons they took away was this notion of you have to actually work with two teams as opposed to one team, right? There has to be a team which is planning ahead, even while there is a team which is planning for the now, all right, dealing with the now. And I think that same analogy I would submit holds true for our world even today and for boards, because I think boards should demand two types of discussions. There is a part of the discussion which is dealing with the fire that exists today, the risks that exist today, the changes in regulations that exist. But at the same time, we should have a plan ahead team in the organization, which is bereft, because it's impossible for any one team to do both, right? It is overwhelming and impossible, because the current will always suck in the future. So this new team, if you may, and typically led by, it could be the CEO, right, who says that, look, I will lead this thinking, or someone very senior, it says that, look, we are going to think about the 3-year round or the 5-year round. What is the world going to be? What are the big themes that will change? How do we make sure that we are winning the future, even while we are surviving the present? And the notion of survival is very important, because if you don't survive, you don't see the future. But once you survive, it's not good enough to just survive. You have to win the future. So, which is why we would always say, having this notion of a plan ahead team in the organization, we would encourage one of the board members to be a part of that plan ahead team, typically, and participate in that, and really use that as a mechanism for thinking about this balancing the now and managing for the future environment.
If I may add to that, Joydeep, I think it's a huge question, this question, and we have to also face the reality that, yes, the optimism is there, there's huge opportunity, but the realism is that this takes years to change culture, because most of our leaders have been groomed in a organizational construct of decades, where what was valued is the knowing, what valued is the telling. What was less valued is the asking. And therefore, we have almost as a reflex learned that we recognize leadership as people that know and that lead from the front. And that model has served us incredibly well as a globally, it has served us fantastically well. However, now in this world of disruption and ambiguity, the downside of this model is very static. It's very good in repeating what it did yesterday, but it's not that good in making bold steps ahead. So this is a culture transformation in many ways. And the good news is you can manage culture actively. It's not a fluffy thing. You can measure it, you can manage it. But it's a new muscle that needs to be built. And I think that challenge in itself is step 0. That has to come from the shareholders, the board, the owners of companies who insist on that. And then the first step along the journey will be to shift away from leaders who tell to leaders who ask, and leverage the creativity and insight in their teams, who typically actually know better because they're in the day-to-day. And that's the first simple step. But step 0 is insisting on defining and managing the culture you aspire, all in service of purpose.
Thank you to both. So, what I picked up is that right now it's impossible for one person to look at the present and the future. It takes a group of people to look at different perspectives, stakeholders, risk, new business model, the consumer behavior, technology, everything. So that actually goes, we were talking about the soft side, but actually goes back to the hard side, which is the board composition. Do we have the right board composition to look at the present and the future, and to look to be the lighthouse of the management? And it sounds to me like the effectiveness of the board room right now is so crucial. Not to mention that even though you have all this balanced view, you have to come up with the conscious decision, which means that the board has to work together properly to come up with that. May I ask you one more thing? If in the boardroom there is fatigue also, what will you do?
Rob, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I didn't know what happened. I guess that's a question to me. Look, honestly, I believe this is where the boardroom has to lead by example, where we actually inspire as partners to our management teams. It's difficult to challenge them on their routines if we are living in the same routines. So I think here as boards, we can actually invest in our capabilities around resilient leadership, what I mentioned before. We can be very conscious in managing our own time and energy. For instance, and this is a very personal example, I fell victim to this fatigue just as anyone else. And I made a few changes in my personal way of working, including doing sports again with my wife. We just have a regular 2 times a week, do sports with my wife. And it's part of the recovery, it's part of the connection, it's part of, I mean, it's very personal. But we have to actually live and role model a more balanced lifestyle, because that will allow us to see the patterns of the other. If we are living in the same hamster wheel than our management teams, we will be of very little counsel.
So if you want other people to have passion and belief, it has to start with you.
Absolutely. I mean, what we say in culture, there is no such thing as culture transformation. There's only many, many personal transformations that hopefully go in the same direction. That will create a new culture, and it has to start on an individual level. If you can't make it, we will always be talking about them. There is no them in this story. There's only I.
Lots of moving dots creating patterns.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. There is one questions from the floor. Should board plan engagement with larger section of the C-suite rather than CEO and CFO alone?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? And here is and there are two elements which I would highlight. One is, in general, I don't think it's a wise idea to engage with the broader group without the consent of the CEO. At the same time, you would want the CEO to provide that consent because it's actually very beneficial to the broader C-suite and to the board to engage with the broader group. So what I'm saying might seem contradictory and paradoxical, but the reality is, as one of the long-standing CEOs have told me, and one of the chairmen have told me, is that, look, I allow the chairman, and I've told the board that, look, please feel free to go and talk to all my one-downs, right? Please feel free, by the way, to go and talk to some of our critical customers, right? But just let me know, right, that you're doing it so that I don't want to be caught by surprise. So I think within certain norms and putting it in, I think it's a really good idea to engage with the broader, because one of the challenges that board members face is that it is very hard for you to be effective if all you are reading are board papers, right, at some level. And you really don't have the pulse to to advise the CEO and the top team effectively with your wisdom and your experience without really engaging, right, on a more systematic basis. But I think the important thing here is not to break the trust and some of the governance norms, because that can it can politicize quite often and it can create complexity. Therefore, doing it transparently, I think, is the way to do it. And I would strongly suggest having that conversation with the CEO and making sure that that's something you do on a transparent basis. I don't think we can hear you.
You are on mute, Kulvech.
Okay.
Ah.
Do you have anything to add? Okay. Okay. If there is nothing, I felt like this 1 hour of discussion lead us to how should the board engage themselves and engage the management to go through this journey, because it takes lots of listening, communication, unlearn, relearn, rewiring your belief. It takes a lot of courage, because you might have to do something that is totally new and very risky to you. So I think that there has to be episode 2 for this, if I may. The episode 2, which is, what do we mean by effective board in the new normal? What should be the composition? What should be the dynamic between the board and the management, with the trust as the linkage? Learn together, fail together, but believe in one thing together. So with this, I would like to ask both of you if you have anything else to as a key takeaway for this. It's just, normally we have lots of people asking questions, but I feel empathy for everyone, because myself, I got goosebumps, and it's very hard for me to come up with questions.
No, thank you. Thank you. We would be delighted to continue the conversation very much, in your next session. The couple of things I thought I would just leave as a marker. I think everything that we talked about implies a much deeper engagement of board members, which means more time. And one of the things which is useful to think about as board members is, how many boards are you a member of, right? And it's very hard, again, to be a member of more than a handful of boards. Whereas I don't know the situation in Thailand, but in some markets, there are board members who are on 10 boards, 8 boards. And I think just given the expectations of what is required in this new environment, I think that's very hard to do real justice. So that would be one aspect. The other aspect is really, and I think you began to touch upon it, which is how do board members themselves, get up to speed and continue to learn, because the world is changing, right? And it's changing very rapidly, and the expectations are that you have the wisdom, but do you have the current knowledge, right? And how are you marrying that together, and how are you keeping yourself updated? So that, these are topics for another conversation, but we would be delighted to have that.
Yes, thank you. And maybe one last thought is, you so beautifully summarized the story with your from tos, from time to energy, etc. Maybe there's another from to that I like to throw on the table for you in the spirit of thinking out loud. And that is from a board perspective from supervision to introspection and partnering.
Okay, it sounds like parenting teenagers. Not parenting little kids anymore. You grow together. Okay, with that, we had such a great insights from this, and I would like to thank McKinsey, and I would like to thank both speakers, Mr. Joydeep, Sengupta, and Mr. Rob Theunissen. And this is not going to be the last episode on this one, but is the episode 1 that would lead to another episode. And thank you for offering that. Let's talk about effective board in the new normal.
Yep.
And how are we going to do? Okay, so with that, I would like to thank all the audience for your participations, and so please let us know what you think. There is a QR code, but before that, the next activity in March is, there are 3 activities now. The first one is Women on Boards. Why now and how to? Why now and how to? Women on Board. The next one is Roadmap and Action Plan for Post-COVID World. And the last one, that is on March the 22nd. The first one, Women on Board, we are fixing the date, and we'll let you know as soon as possible. And the last one is Introduction to PDPA, and its awareness for organization on March 30th. Actually, when we say introduction, it does not mean introduction like at ABC, because PDPA has been announced for years. It's just the lesson learned from the PDPA execution. Okay. So meanwhile, please stay safe, and many thanks to both Kun Rob and Kun Joydeep. สวัสดีครับ